Hi everyone, it's Dr. Lades, and I want to just describe the purposes and use of this record of preparation and disposition of remains. It is a DD 2063, and it is an embalming report that is used when the Department of Defense is coordinating initial care from a civilian funeral home. So what happens is you have funeral homes that either already have a contractual agreement in areas where there is considerable population of DoD personnel. So for example, in like Camp Pendleton area, you may have a contract in place, or Jacksonville, Florida. Or you could be in a situation where there is no existing contract and the DoD needs a funeral home in the vicinity where death occurred to process the remains of an eligible person, such as active duty, etc. So that is when this form is going to be used. This is not something you'll typically use in the civilian sector, and it's honestly not recommended for use as your basic embalming report, because it's going to contain information that is not going to be relevant necessarily in a regular civilian situation. Where you're just providing care on a regular basis outside of a DoD obligation. It does not capture the full range of care you provide necessarily, or allow a lot of space for detail, and it has a lot of space in it that we'll talk about that's utilized for calculating cost as well as performing the necessary inspections. But having said that, let's go over this form. So the to section is going to be who this form is going to. Now, obviously, you know you're going to have a copy of your embalming report within your case file in the funeral home, but you may have the branch of service that's specifically coordinating care asking for a copy of this. So it may be U.S. Navy Mortuary Affairs with their address. So who is going to need a copy of this? It may be a decedent affairs officer that's coming out to perform inspection and needs a copy for their record. So that is who is getting this. The name of authority arranging preparation. Now here you would say, Navy Mortuary Affairs, and I would put the name of the person who is arranging and coordinating and requesting your services. That's who needs to go here. And then what organization do they represent? Okay. If you are using this for strictly a civilian situation, maybe you would put the name of the legal next of kin, who's the authorizing agent, in this section. Your funeral home is going to go in here under receiving funeral home and address. Okay. That's going to be you. And then down here in section 4, we get into the decedent data. So here is where, again, they're assuming this is a person who's eligible for care through a DoD affiliation. So is it an active duty person? Is it a government contractor? Is it, a person in any type of category, like a dependent or a thing of that nature, a civilian employee? Are they going to be getting care? And then this is where you would specify what branch of service they are affiliated with, who they work for is your organization, their name. Grade is like rank, okay? So if it is a petty officer second class, it's going to be E5. You may put specialist, SPC, whatever the acronym is that describes their rank. And then their social security or DoD ID number. And then obviously date of death, means of identification. So in the government, we utilize a form called a 565, and that's a statement of recognition form. And that is something where the family or a party that knows a decedent would sign off validating that that is in fact the person, kind of like you would use if you have a cremation situation and you want the family or someone who knows the decedent to physically identify them. It may be a situation where you have a photocopy of a passport or an ID. So how do you know that's that person? What did you utilize to confirm the identification, right? So you're going to put that in there. Now, person authorized the disposition of the remains, or they're called the PAD. And this is the person's like the authorizing agent who is giving you permission. Now, in the DoD system with active duty cases, if they have two parents, then usually within their paperwork that they have on file on record, they specify who they would want to take care of making these decisions. So that is whose name would go here. Okay. And you should be getting that information from whomever is arranging the care. Obviously, their relationship and their address would go here. Okay. So this is just kind of laying the foundation of the case's origin. And then you're going to get into your information. So when did you receive the person at your mortuary? Notice the date formatting, and you're going to put your hours and military time. What time the embalming started and what day, and then when it ended. Okay. In D, obviously, you're going to explain delays. So, for example, if there was an autopsy, if local officials did not release within so much time, Whatever the reasoning here, go ahead and just make a note of it here, okay? Even if it was that the medical examiner had them for a couple days, anything that delayed you getting started from between the time they died to you getting started, just make a little note in here of what, what was going on. The type of case, now there are different categories within the DoD when it talks about viewability. You have viewable, non-viewable, and viewable for identification, okay? There's also, so when you're looking at these, right, there's also considerations you have to make about whether or not they were autopsied. You're going to mark that. Any type of trauma would be mutilated. So within the DoD descriptions, viewable means, they're totally fine. They're going to look just like they should. Maybe you didn't have trauma to deal with, or you had maybe just light cosmetics that you had to utilize. Viewable for identification means they maybe sustained some trauma. They look like themselves, like you can tell that that is that person when you compare like a photo. However, they don't look their best, okay? And then non-viewable, self-explanatory, that's a situation where you're going to have a decomp or something of that nature where they're not suitable for viewing. So you want to make sure you're familiar if you're doing this, again, on this DoD form, make sure you understand thoroughly what their definitions of these different viewability categories are, okay? Because if you're talking to a DoD person, a decedent affairs officer, a mortuary affairs officer, when they hear these words, there's significant meaning and assumptions based on these things, okay? So down here, embalming treatment, your vessels for drainage, your fluid mixes. Now, within the DoD system, they're going to expect that your standard case is going to be at a 5% concentration. And then if it is a decomposition case, they expect a 10% concentration. So anytime when you're doing your calculations, don't forget about the Embalm Calc app. You can utilize that anytime if you're just trying to kind of sort out to get to the index you're trying to get to, and just kind of have a firm understanding of the strength of your fluid, what you're pouring in there, what it actually comes out to in terms of your secondary dilution. I encourage you to use that app. I use it on occasion. It's great. So this is where you're going to indicate your injections. Remember, it's a gallon to every 50 pounds is the DoD standard as well, okay? And then if you use hardening compounds, obviously if it's an autopsy case and you're using things like Visceroc, you're going to put that here, your drainage and so on, just like a regular embalming report. Or you have your total concentrated fluid. Sometimes when you're filling this out, injection. I know it says pre-injection, but there's anything special you added in here. Sometimes I will add dye and how much I use, and I'll make a note of it. Additional prep, where did you have to hypo? So for example, if it's an autopsy case, you know that you hypodermically injected the back, the shoulders, the buttock area, the side walls, right? The chest area, behind the neck, heart's receiving portion, a different vessel, and separately inject a hand or something of that nature. So you want to make sure you're putting a note here. If it is a case where you had to address it more so, you want to put what did you do? So maybe you did a topical treatment, you hypodermically injected, whatever you did here, make a note of that. And then finally, your restoration, okay? What did you do to restore the form? If there was trauma, if there was discolorations, you want to try to leave some notes in here as well. Okay. So again, this to me, it doesn't have a whole lot of room to elaborate, but it kind of is what it is. And then finally, you're going to indicate your name, your license number, obviously your state where you're from, and your signature. Now down here is where you get into merchandise, casket and or urn that was used. Keeping in mind, again, this is a DoD form, so it's only going to expect you to have a metal. The DoD offering at this time is 18 gauge steel, or solid hardwood is the offering at this time. And then the name of the casket, oftentimes for us, we would write in solid hardwood, or we would write in 18 gauge steel. And then if you did use an urn, which kind, because again, there's bronze and then there's wood, and then you're going to mention your manufacturer here. If it is military urn, they're going to expect an emblem as well. And then when you're providing service, is it because you have a continuous agreement in place, like every year you have a contract with them to take care of the remains within that time frame, or is it a one-time situation where they needed help, right? Finally, in this section here, your expenses. Here's where you're going to put your charges, recovery, and this could be mileage, transport of remains to funeral home, anything of that nature here. The casket itself, clothing, if you had to purchase clothing. In some cases, usually you would have a uniform provided, but let's say that it was a civilian situation and you had to go out and buy clothing. If you had to provide the burial flag and so on and so forth, okay? And then your charges here. If you flew the remains, then it would be the charges for air, And then, of course, this is self-explanatory. Did you drive them? Take them on a ship? The escort will typically have their arrangements made separately, okay, through the casualty branch that is associated with that branch that the decedent is from, in the event that there is an escort, okay? And there's your total, basically what you're going to bill them. This gets into submission of your voucher, okay? You'd have a system that they use for bill submission. If an oversized casket's used, make a note of why. It could be height related, it could be width related, but you always want to kind of make a note of that. And then down here, you're signing off and saying that you provided the items and the services in the specific way that the contract called for, okay? So for example, that index, that concentration of fluid I talked to you about, the casket you provided, so it has to be within the context of, they have a document called a performance work statement, or PWS, and that is going to be where the guidance lay in terms of merchandise and specific expectations and care, okay? So that's what you would consult. And then your address here, okay? And then finally, this is your inspection, okay? Remains, casket, shipping. So remains are inspected 3 different times. They're inspected after embalming, they're inspected after dressing, and then they're inspected after placement in the casket. And usually this is done by a decedent affairs officer, a representative from mortuary affairs will come, whoever is doing that. And then the consignee is the basically the receiving end of where the person is going, okay? That's going to be your shipping date. But you'll see here, these are all things that have to be inspected. You have the actual body itself being inspected, making sure that everything is as it should be, clean appearance, natural. If they're in uniform, then their hair and everything should be within military standards. Here you're looking at identification, you know, making sure even small details. You don't have cosmetic in the eyebrows. If they are non-viewable, were they properly wrapped the right way? A uniform is placed over non-viewable remains and they're wrapped. There's a whole process with the blanket and a full body wrap process that takes place, as well as a head wrap process for those that are non-viewable. So you would specify that here. And then down here is going to be the inspector's information. Okay, who's coming to inspect, their own grade, where they're coming from, and they may make a notes here. Okay, and then they're going to sign it here. So this is the full circle of care from receiving the decedent into providing the actual inspection. And again, this is a DD form, so this is not something that I would recommend you utilize in the civilian sector, because as you can see, a lot of this is very specific to DoD, and it doesn't give you much flexibility here, okay? If you're doing topical embalming of a fetus, for example, like how are you going to be able to really capture that in any type of detail or anything like that? So I hope this is helpful. I hope you find it applicable to you based upon your question. And of course, if you do have questions about a form of this nature or anything mortuary specific, do feel free to reach out to me and I'm happy to try to help.